Mr. Grayson and the two Mr. Warnicks would have been very proud of the bank today.
I'd call it one of the principal anchors to our economy. It's the key to how we get along.
So it's rewarding, you know, to feel like that people were benefited from the services of Farmers Bank. And I'm just proud to have been part of that.
The year was 1906, and the dawn of a new century was casting a glow on the face of the world. It was an important year, a year that a century later would still reflect in the world around us. In 1906, in Oak Park, Illinois, Frank Lloyd Wright unveiled his Unity Temple, a marvel of modern architecture. While on the other side of the world, in Dublin, Ireland, Samuel Beckett was born to one day challenge the circles of literature to a new and innovative style. And in 1906, in Magnolia, Arkansas, a bank was born. A bank that influenced a town, influenced its people, and 100 years later still takes pride in its tradition of service.
There were two other principal banks in Columbia County when Farmers Bank was founded. There was Columbia County Bank, which Mr. Warnick had helped found earlier, and there was People's Bank. The record of the founding of the bank is not clear. There's very little in the newspapers about it, but in late 1905, it shows Mr. Warnick still associated with Columbia County Bank. He's vice president, member of the board of directors. And then the Columbia Banner indicates that in October of that year, he sold his stock. And some months later, in 1906, secured a charter and founded Farmers Bank.
Farmers Bank and Trust was chartered for operation on September 26, 1906, with a capital stock of $100,000. Robert Warnick and Samuel Grayson were the key figures in this event, and both were self-made men who achieved their status in the community through hard work and determination. Robert S. Warnick was born in 1856 and raised on a farm in Columbia County, Arkansas, with 7 brothers and sisters. Throughout his youth, Warnick split his time between his education and his work as a farmhand, for which he earned $10 a month. And by the age of 17, he purchased his own land on credit and became a farmer in his own right. With his success in agriculture, Warnick moved to Magnolia in 1888, where he established a mule trading business and developed new farming interest. By 1892, he played a dominant role in the founding of Columbia County Bank, the first bank in the county, and was elected vice president. But Warnick had political ambitions as well, and just 2 years after the founding of Farmers Bank, was elected to the state legislature by the largest majority ever for that office. Samuel Grayson was born in 1870 and grew up in Hamilton County, Tennessee, as one of 10 children. As the story goes, Grayson left school in the 2nd grade, bought a team of oxen, and got a job hauling timber to earn money for his family. But while his formal education may have ended early, the education he received while working taught him everything he needed to know to become successful. Eventually, he would go from hauling the timber to milling it, and over time established a business of logging and milling. By 1890, Grayson married and moved with his family to Liberty Township in Arkansas, where he continued his interests in timber. Within a couple of years, he started a family of his own, and near the turn of the century, had settled his family in Magnolia. With these 2 men leading the bank, with Warnick as the first president of the bank and Grayson as the first vice president, it was on their reputations that the bank would either fail or succeed.
the man whose name was behind the bank, the group of men that owned the bank, were actually responsible for the status of the bank. The guarantee of the bank was built on their names. So Mr. Warnock Sr. and Mr. Grayson would have been two such men that would have had status and position in the community that would have enhanced the growth of a bank.
And while the names behind the bank played a big part in Farmer's success, the name of the bank was equally important. But to understand this, you first have to understand Magnolia and something about the politics of the time.
Columbia County, like most of the rest of Arkansas, was almost entirely agricultural. Cotton growing was the biggest business and the moneymaker. And there were very few other sources of income or employment.
Well, if you look at some of the old pictures, if you can imagine right out where we're at right here, you can see a picture from the courthouse, and then with just a 2 or 3 block area, this was cotton fields. This was, I mean, you had kind of the center of the town and some roads leading out, but a lot of this was farming.
There had been created a new farmers organization that established in Texas in 1902 and coming into Arkansas in 1904 called the Farmers Union. And it was, for a period of 10 years or so, the largest, most dynamic farmers organization in the country, but especially in the South. Mr. Warnock founded the bank and deliberately called it Farmers Bank, I think because he was playing to the organization. The slogan of Farmers Bank, we know from the ads later in the newspaper, is that Farmers Bank, the bank that backs the farmer. And obviously he's oriented toward securing their business, but I think he may also have been oriented toward securing their political support.
It could vary, the name choice of Farmers Bank could have come from the farmers movement that was very prevalent at that time. It also could have come from the fact that Mr. Warnock was a farmer and he believed in farmers' rights and very strong individualist, supporting individual rights. And at that time, farmers would have been the majority of the people in South Arkansas. So he was looking for that enhancing individual rights, individual position.
Whatever the reason for the name, Farmers Bank was a success. In 1910, the continued growth led to a new home for the bank on the corner of Main and Washington, on the north corner of the town square. And in 1916, with Warnock focusing his attention on his political career after 2 successful terms in the state legislature, Grayson became president of the bank. In 1921, farmers could claim the title as the largest bank in Columbia County, while in 1927 saw the acquisition of another bank, also called Farmers, in Emerson, Arkansas. But nestled in the corner of southwest Arkansas, even the little town of Magnolia couldn't avoid the Great Depression. What started with the stock market crash in 1929 soon spread across the country. Farmers in rural areas were hit hard as prices for crops fell by as much as 60%. For a town like Magnolia, with an economy based in farming and lumber, it was a frightening period in history. But despite the chaos that surrounded them, Farmers Bank withstood the storm. Proof of this would come in 1933.
And on March the 4th, 1933, just the weekend before Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated as President of the United States, they declared a bank holiday and all banks were closed. Every bank in the United States was closed. And the comptroller of the currency, or the Treasury Department, took over control of all the banks.
And
then when it was over, there were instances where you could only draw 5% of your money. The reason being that the banks were loaned up and they had to liquidate securities in order to pay off the depositors. So sometimes it would be 2 or 3 years before you could get your money out.
Now, I wasn't there, but when that started happening, the bank started closing, that Granddaddy Grayson took a satchel full of money and sat there by the desk. And when people came in, he'd say, well, how much money you want? Well, Sam, what are you doing with your money? He said, I'm leaving it here in the bank. I don't want somebody to steal it. Oh, well, if you're doing it, one of them called him Sammy. And, well, Sammy, if you're doing that, I'll leave mine here too. So that way, they always say it, is how he stopped a run on the bank.
Farmers Bank went right along and did business as usual through most of the Depression years, whereas the other bank didn't really get organized till about 1935 or 36. So for a 2-year period there, Farmers Bank was the only bank you could do business with in Magnolia.
At the height of the Depression in 1933, Robert Warnick passed away. For nearly 20 more years, Sam Grayson would remain president and foster the growth of the bank through the oil boom of the 30s and 40s and to a peak of $9 million in assets in 1946. But in 1950, with his health deteriorating, Sam Grayson stepped down as president and the last of the founding fathers was gone. Grayson was replaced by John B. Lee, who was replaced a year later by Robert Warnick Jr. For more than 30 years, Warnick Jr. would lead and guide the bank through numerous changes. He would see the addition of women tellers and bookkeepers in 1954. He would be there when the bank hit a milestone $12 million in assets in 1961. And he would oversee the creation of the bank's first drive-through branch at East Main and Jackson in 1975. It was with Warnick Jr. that Farmers truly became the family bank of Magnolia. And that tradition would continue in 1984 as the mantle was passed to his grandson-in-law, Bob Burns.
Bob went to work at the bank in about 1978-79 as a bank director. He was superintendent of schools at the time. And as we began to look for another school system to move to, from a small system to a little larger system, what we found was the size of Magnolia was what we really liked. And we wanted to raise our children in a town the size of Magnolia. And so we came to Magnolia to try Magnolia for a short period of time. And when we got here, we found that Bob loved banking. And he could use all his education in administration and his military background and his school administration background to enhance the bank and the growth of the bank.
With Bob Burns at the helm, Farmers Bank moved swiftly into new waters, steering the bank in a direction that shed worries born out of the past, most important of which was the Depression. For most of its history, Farmers Bank could best be described as conservative. That is, they didn't lend money easily or frequently. And while this philosophy allowed the bank to survive the Great Depression, it was also the reason the growth of the bank stalled in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But growth required change, and for a bank with roots so firmly planted in the past, that change would not come easily. But Burns persevered, and under his leadership, the bank modernized into computer technology, added new branches, and grew the assets from $31 million in 1980 to $135 million by 1990. But even with the remarkable achievements made in just the past 20 years, Burns is philosophical about the future and the past.
If you look back through all that history, we've been here, and we've been a part of the community during World War I. We were here when penicillin was discovered in 1928. We survived the Great Depression with our customers and the horrible period of time during World War II when Columbia County lost a lot of veterans during the World War II conflict. Came back immediately with Korea and Vietnam. And we've been here all that time. And somebody has always had to have stewardship over the bank during those changes in social and economic and political activities of our nation. So I only buy in on the last quarter century, but somebody had to keep it for the other 75% of the time. And I think it's significant that the bank has been here for 100 years, never changed its name, its ownership group, but is still as modern and sophisticated as you would find any bank in the country. And I think it's time at the 100th anniversary to rejoice and to look back upon that period, but not spend a lot of time with it. Our goal is to make history, not reflect upon the past. And so the way I look at it, today is just tomorrow's history.
And the history of today is just beginning. In 2006, Farmers Bank and Trust has over $500 million in assets, over 160 employees, and 11 locations in 3 cities. It's the dawn of a brand new century, and Farmers Bank and Trust is not looking back.